Lines and layers. This is how we tend to think about repression in psychoanalysis. Here is a line. Repression, we assume, must involve pushing something down below it. The return of the repressed, its re-emergence. Here is another line. There must be somewhere it's pushed down into and somewhere it re-emerges from. Let's call these a conscious, an unconscious, and a preconscious. How we think about psychical space, the internal world and what supposedly goes on inside it, dictates how we think about repression. But this model presents several problems. Who or what is doing the repressing? If it's me or part of me, I would first have to know, at some level, what it is that I'm repressing. But if I already know it, why repress it? What would repressing it achieve? And anyway, how can I both know and not know something at the same time? After all, just making what's unconscious conscious isn't enough to remove repression. If it were, psychotherapy would be easy. A therapist just tells me what I've repressed and I'm over it. But in reality, this is like handing out menus to relieve a famine. Maybe I have to both know and accept it before I can overcome repression. However difficult it might be, the key would then lie in being honest with myself and accepting myself. But why can't I do this from the beginning? What is it that I cannot confront which would need to be repressed in the first place? So, what if repression actually begins outside of me? Societal norms, for example, that I have internalized. The Victorians were supposed to be repressed about sex, and surely we'd now overcome those taboos. Yet we still see repression at work, through the return of the repressed. If a repressed trauma, for instance, breaks through, what makes that trauma traumatic? What makes it traumatic for one person but not another, or for the same person at different points in their life? We have to ask what significance the repressed has for me, and me in particular, if at some level I am the agent of my own repression. Psychoanalysis is about asking these questions of ourselves. But first, we have to ask them of psychoanalysis. We have to think differently about repression for it to mean anything, and Lacan's work, following Freud's, can be seen as a constant effort to undermine this simplistic view of repression as lines and layers. So in this video, we will look at several ways he did so, through music, metaphor, and myth. We saw in parts 1 and 2 how repression and the return of the repressed are the same thing. It's not the pushing down of something into the unconscious. So rather than thinking of repression like this, let's start off by thinking of repression like this. Let's say we find something difficult to talk about. There's a resistance somewhere, whether loosely speaking from the inside or the outside. It might be that we find it hard to talk about a particular memory or experience in our lives. Or it might be that we want to talk about something, but an outside agency like a state censor forbids it. Lacan's idea is that it will always come out, that the truth will always find expression. How does this happen? Through what Lacan calls a sort of discordance between the signified and the signifier. A resistance or censorship is overcome if we introduce disparity between the signifier and the signified, between the representation and its supposed referent, to undermine or destabilize a particular meaning. To explain this, Lacan starts by going back to what Freud said about censorship, repression, and a particular way of listening for it. What does Freud tell us, in fact? He reveals to us a phenomenon that structures every revelation of truth in the psychoanalytic dialogue. There is a fundamental difficulty that the subject encounters in what he has to say. The most common is the one that Freud demonstrated in Repression, namely the sort of discordance between the signified and the signifier that's brought on by all censorship of social origin. The truth can always, in this case, be communicated between the lines. That is, he who wishes to make the truth known can always adopt the technique indicated by the fact that truth is identical to the symbols that reveal it. In other words, he can always arrive at his ends by deliberately introducing into a text discordance. Lacan makes three crucial points here. First, we have the idea of the return of the repressed between the lines. Second, the idea that repression is not the repression of a thing, but the repression of a truth, something we looked at in part 1. And third, that we can operate on repression by treating it as a text, and by deliberately introducing into this text discordance. To do this, we have to listen for repression across lines that aren't layers. A text implies a language, and language is taken to have two axes. These are called the diachronic axis, which is the way that a language evolved over time, and the synchronic axis, the way that the elements of a language relate to each other as a system right now. But let's simplify things and switch from language to music. Let's think of these as melodic and harmonic axes, like you'd find on a musical score, where the melody is the tune and the harmony is the combination of individual notes played together. At the same time as Lacan was using axes of language to think about repression, someone else in Paris was using axes of music to think about a different problem, the problem of myth. The brilliant deciphering of myth by the structural anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss heavily influenced Lacan's work in psychoanalysis in the 1950s. Lévi-Strauss' idea is that we should read a myth the same way we read music. Exactly as in a musical score, he says, we can't just read across, like we'd read a novel or a newspaper article, but up and down. It's not just sequential, it's combinatorial. It's not just melodic, it's harmonic. We have to read myth as we would read an orchestral score, as a whole, so that something written on the first stave acquires meaning only if you see it as part and parcel of what is written below on the second stave, the third stave, and so on. We have to read not only from left to right, he says, but at the same time vertically, from top to bottom. What does this have to do with repression? Lacan's idea was that we should listen for the repressed in what he called the half-said, the interdit, which, by the way, is a pun on forbidden in French. And this is very meta because Lacan's expressing the idea of the repressed as the half-said by half-saying something with the term half-said. Either you find this very clever and deep, or you just think it's a play on words and pretty stupid. But it's classic Lacan, and one of the reasons people either love or hate reading him. Let's take a couple of examples to show this half-said at work in repression and myth. Before setting sail to kill the Minotaur in the Greek myth, Theseus tells his father, King Aegeus, that if he's successful, he'll swap the black sail on his ship for a white one on his way back. He kills the Minotaur, but then he forgets to change the sail, and when Aegeus doesn't see a white sail, he throws himself off a cliff into what became known thereafter as the Aegean Sea. As psychoanalyst Darian Leader explains, we have two relations. A son deliberately kills a non-human who isn't kin, and a son accidentally kills a human who is kin. We don't find repression in either, but in the relation between them. The deliberate wish to kill a human kin is half-said, interdit. It's a combination of both parts of the story. Second example. In the folk tale of Little Red Riding Hood, the young girl is instructed by her mother not to talk to strangers on the way to visit her grandmother. She disobeys and talks to the wolf, but then avoids talking to the woodcutter who later comes to save her. Once again, Leader explains, we have a series of relations. A daughter disobeys a prohibition by talking to a dangerous non-human, and the daughter obeys a prohibition by not talking to a safe human. In between, we could guess that there lies a dangerous desire between a girl and an older man. Like a myth, what we think of as the censorship of repression works via the half-said, the interdit, between two contradictory currents. What's more, when we look at what Freud said about dreams, slips of the tongue, jokes, and symptoms themselves, they all appear to be formed in this way, through a distortion, a composite figure, or a compromise formation, as he calls it. And perhaps surprisingly, psychotherapy itself works when it mirrors this process. By bringing into relation two things of a seemingly different order, even if they are contradictory to each other, perhaps because they are contradictory to each other, a therapeutic effect can be produced. Let's go back to lines and layers and look at another way that Lacan tried to subvert the simplistic model of repression we started with. This time with metaphor. A metaphor, simply defined, is a signifying substitution. Here is a simplified version of how a metaphor works. The signified, lowercase s, is determined by a signifier, s1. Another signifier, s2, is substituted for the first, which creates a new signification, a metaphor. And here is an example using a simple metaphor, John is a lion, to express the idea that John is brave. Now, Lacan gives us a couple of models of metaphor in the écrit, but the key thing to understand is that there's a signifying substitution at work. Although Freud doesn't talk about metaphor, this is exactly the process he's describing when he says that the idea which is repressed leads to the creation of a substitutive formation. Metaphor allows the possibility of a new meaning to emerge. Like myth, it doesn't fix us to a single signification for the same element, the same signifier. And like myth, it can help us to rethink a problem by rephrasing it, even if it's not possible to solve it. This idea also helps us out with one of the questions we started with. If something is repressed, where is it repressed to? As we saw in part 1, Lacan thought that the repressed and the return of the repressed are the same thing. Picture an Egyptian monument with the same hieroglyph written on both sides, surrounded by other hieroglyphs which are different on both sides. You have no idea what they mean, but you know they meant something to someone at some point. Lacan uses this image to demonstrate what happens when an element is repressed. Rather than being pushed down, it remains on the surface, yet its signification changes because the network of signifying connections is different on both sides. This is how symptoms are formed from what is repressed. Symptoms, Lacan says, seem irrational because you take them in an isolated manner. You want to interpret them directly. As long as we look for the direct meaning of vultures, chickens, the standing, sitting or moving men in hieroglyphics, the writing remains indecipherable. When taken by itself, the sign vulture means nothing. It only finds its signifying value when taken within the context of the set of the system to which it belongs. Well, he says, psychoanalysis deals with this order of phenomena. They belong to the order of language. A psychoanalyst is not an explorer of an unknown continent or of great depths. He is a linguist. He learns to decipher the writing which is under his eyes, present to the sight of all. However, that writing remains indecipherable if we lack its laws, its key. For more on this point, check out my video, What's So Unconscious About the Unconscious. Now let's return to another problem we raised at the start. For something to be repressed, don't you at some level have to know what it is in order to repress it? If what's repressed is supposed to be unconscious, doesn't this lead us into a contradiction? Freud had written a very short but very rich paper on this problem called Negation in 1925. It's only about 5 pages long, but when it comes to figuring out psychoanalysis, it's one of the most important things you can read. Negation, he says, is the hallmark of the unconscious, like made in Germany that you'd find stamped on a product. Freud gives us an example. You ask who this person in the dream can be. It's not my mother. So it is his mother, Freud thinks. This might sound a little silly to us knowing what we know about Freud and mothers, but the problem behind it has given philosophers a lot to think about. Lacan invites one of those philosophers, Jean Hippolyte, over to his seminar to walk us through what's going on here. If someone says, "This is what I am not," we can see that the repression still persists in the guise of negation. To make something conscious does not mean it's no longer unconscious. But what if the psychoanalyst tells you something and you accept it rather than rejecting it? Well, still the repression persists. This seems very profound to me, Hippolyte says. If the psychoanalyzed person accepts this, he goes back on his negation, and yet the repression is still there. So Hippolyte feels it warrants a new term, negation of the negation. Anything that we're supposed to repress can't be unrepressed just by knowing it or by accepting it intellectually, because an intellectual affirmation can take this form of a negation of the negation. The repression persists in either case. As a result, we can't think of the repressed and the unconscious as the same thing, as if the unconscious were just the sum of the repressed, because we can repress something while knowing it all the same. As Hippolyte explains, the person who is speaking says, "This is what I am not." There would no longer be any repression here if repression signified unconsciousness, since it's conscious, but the crux of the repression persists in the form of unacceptance. This is why psychoanalysis is different from confession. In confession, you tell the priest what you know. In psychoanalysis, you tell the analyst what you know and what you don't know that you know. Psychoanalysis, in this sense, is like revealing a particular kind of knowledge, a knowledge of which you are unaware. This presents a problem for how we think about repression, but especially for any psychotherapy that aims, however tacitly, at self-revelation, self-discovery, or self-affirmation. Fundamentally, just knowing something doesn't matter and nothing will change. As we saw in parts 1 and 2, what happens instead is that the repressed returns in a ciphered form, that is, as a compromise formation, which is what Lacan means when he says that repression is not the repression of a thing, but the repression of a truth. But what's really interesting about negation is what it presupposes. To go down the rabbit hole of negation is to assume a whole model of the internal world, and in just 5 pages that's exactly what Freud gives us. We can read it as a myth about the genesis of the inside and the outside, the inner world and the outer world, the creation of that very division itself. This is why Lacan called it Freud's myth. Given that the idea of an internal world is the basis for pretty much all psychology, this is indeed a big deal. So how do we get all of that from just 5 pages? Let's take a quick look at Freud's negation paper, not to go into all its intricacies, but just to touch on the parts most relevant to repression. The most important idea is that negation, or more precisely what he calls the symbol of negation, presupposes the function of judgment. Freud thinks that there are 2 kinds of judgment: the judgment of existence and the judgment of attribution. We'll look only at the existence branch for now. Just as negation presupposes judgment, so judgment presupposes existence. Because you have to at some level accept or affirm that something exists in order to negate it. You have to have Bejahung in order to have Verneinung. Negation is a way of taking cognizance of what is repressed, Freud says. It presupposes an acknowledgement that something exists, because otherwise no psychical mechanism could act on it. Negation is a lifting of repression, he writes, but not an acceptance of what is repressed. The judgment of existence leads us in turn to a distinction between perception and presentation. Let's say you perceive something, you see it, for instance. This isn't enough to establish reality. You might see something that isn't there, or not see something that is there. Instead, you have to represent it to yourself, and this is an act of thinking. Freud's idea is that we make the judgment of existence not simply based on whether or not we perceive the same thing again in reality, but whether it is refound. And by refound, he doesn't mean seeing or perceiving it again. He means establishing what he called in his earlier work an identity of perception. The aim and end of all thought processes is thus to bring about a state of identity, Freud had written. And Lacan elaborates this by saying that consciousness itself is made up of a consistency of perceptions, which result from this process. What we understand as reality is based on the articulation of perceptions between themselves in a world. There is a kind of mapping between perception, presentation, and representation. So it's not about memory, it's about repetition. It's not about seeing something, but about establishing a representation that works when the object is not there. And instead of finding the object, it's about refinding it in accordance with a certain representation. You can make do with the presentation because you don't have the object, but you make the judgment of existence on the basis of the consistency of that presentation. established through a network of representations. The distinction this brings about between the internal world and the external world, the inside and the outside, doesn't exist from the start. It's created through a process that leads from perception to presentation to representation to thinking and then to judging. But there's a sting in this tale. Freud writes, "But the performance of the function of judgment is not made possible until the creation of the symbol of negation has endowed thinking with a first measure of freedom from the consequences of repression." Why doesn't he say that judgment is only possible as a result of affirmation instead of negation? And why a symbol of negation rather than negation itself? What this symbol of negation does is to allow that a margin for thought can be generated, an appearance of being so in the guise of not being so. With the help of the symbol of negation, Freud says, thinking frees itself from the restrictions of repression and enriches itself with material that is indispensable for its proper functioning. So, being able to use this symbol of negation is massively important. And we have to distinguish the symbol of negation from the attitude of negation in order to answer our original question, how it's possible to first know something in order to repress it. Lastly, what Freud meant when he said at the end of the negation paper that there is no no in the unconscious also now makes sense. If you negate, in the sense of negation as a symbol, you don't need to repress. The beauty of Freud's work is how refined it is in separating out tightly bound concepts like knowledge, repression, and negation. Repression is a mechanism, but one among many, and Freud was very careful in making precise distinctions between repression and other psychical mechanisms that he thought could be at play. Being able to see the difference is really important if we want to know what's going on with someone on the couch. One mechanism in particular, which can look very much like repression and negation, but is totally different, caught Lacan's attention when he was thinking about psychosis in the early 1950s. The term Freud used to describe it was Verwerfung, which Lacan initially translated as excision, but then changed his mind and called foreclosure. Lacan based his theory of psychosis on this idea of foreclosure because he thought it was the mechanism which distinguished psychosis from anything else. To take an example, people have argued for over 100 years about what was going on with one of Freud's most famous patients, Sergei Pankev, better known as the Wolfman, and Lacan thought he'd found a clue in a small but precise distinction Freud makes in the case history. A repression is something very different from a condemning judgment, Freud writes. And then later, when I speak of the Wolfman having rejected it, the first meaning of the phrase is that he would have nothing to do with it, in the sense of having repressed it. This really involved no judgment upon the question of its existence, but it was the same as if it did not exist. Lacan pricks up his ears. What Freud is describing is different from repression, and it's not a rejection of something that at some level we know already but refuse to acknowledge. Whereas in repression, as we saw, there is a primary judgment of affirmation. What marks out foreclosure is that the thing isn't even let in to begin with. There is no primordial symbolization, it's simply excluded. Verwerfung is the absence of Bejahung, Lacan says. This category contains everything that is rejected from the symbolic, a category Lacan calls the real, and in psychotic hallucination what is rejected from the symbolic returns in the real in a way that's terrifying and nonsensical to the person experiencing it. Now, this is tricky to spot because foreclosure so often looks like repression. Even Freud got this wrong, Lacan thought, which is why he had such problems with the Wolfman's case. Clinically, we may not always know it when we see it, but Lacan tells us a little bit about what it looks like. A resistance without transference, or like a punctuation without a text, in his beautiful phrase. This rabbit hole runs deep, and we haven't yet peered into its darkest corner, the hypothesis of primal repression. Because everything we've said about repression over the last 3 videos still leaves us with a fundamental question. How is it that something is repressed to begin with? Where does the unconscious come from in the first place? And what keeps it unconscious? If you'd like to see a bonus video that answers these questions by exploring primal repression, leave a comment below and click the thumbs up. For more videos like this on other topics, click subscribe and hit the bell icon to see them as they're released. And for much more exploring psychoanalysis and the work of Jacques Lacan, visit lacanonline.com.